had negotiated in good faith with whoever you were supposed to negotiate with, and then you had improved the land. First Nations transferred possession and use rights to the government through treaty and purchase contracts. And the First Nations also at times sold land directly to speculators. But Congress, one of its very first acts in the 1780s was to make it illegal for private individuals to engage in economic matters with Indian authorities. This legislation was an important element in excluding Native Americans from the developing U.S. economy, and it contributed to their being forced into the position of dependent nations, living within but formally not part of the United States. This was a position that was reinforced in 1871 when Congress abolished all treaties with Native nations, while insisting that Native nations, the members of Native nations, remained foreign peoples living within the borders of the United States. So there were foreign peoples without their own land after 1871. And they had no rights as U.S. citizens unless they left their tribe and moved into an Anglo-American community. The government held acquired land as what they called public domain. It was held for the common good, but with the assumption that most lands were to be allocated to individual owners at some point. The government sold the rights to develop land to speculators whose rights depended upon them creating infrastructure and that would connect the land in question to markets that would then make the new communities of farmers and settlers in the towns economically viable. There had to be a division of land into clearly defined plots that had been surveyed, and without that you wouldn't have defensible titles that would hold up in court. The grants to speculators had defined time limits, and if they failed to make sufficient improvements, they lost their rights, and the land reverted back to the public domain. Generally, speculators had to improve the land and sell it off within 9 years' time. You couldn't just get a plot of land and hold on to it until it ultimately might become valuable. If you wanted to hold on to the land, you were going to have to invest money. You were going to have to build wharfs on the riverbanks. You were going to have to build roads. You were going to have to build warehouses and the various things that people needed in order to have a community. This is similar to the Morrill Act of 1863, which funded higher education in the United States by providing 1/4 of public lands lying along rail lines to railroad companies that went ahead and built those railways. But the railroads had only 9 years to prepare their land for sale to the public, or they would lose the land they had failed to develop. The Morrill Act also set aside an even larger amount of the public domain for squatters or homesteaders, as they would call, who acquired title if they resided on the land for 5 continuous years and made improvements, such as building a house, not a cabin, but actually a house with doors and windows and insulation. They had to build barns, watering systems, etc. Now, homestead land, squatter land, was generally not near railroads, so that would also require them to have their town and county governments invest in the public development of roads or to seek additional railroad investments before farmers could reap the fullest benefit. One of the great conflicts of the mid-19th century, and it was a constant theme in Western novels and then in Hollywood Westerns, was the war between ranchers and farmers that took place in the Great Plains in the West. Ranchers would go into relatively arid regions, often taking possession of vast range areas along railroad lines. They would pasture cattle and sheep, which would then be shipped via railroad back to the Midwest, to slaughterhouses in Des Moines or Moline or Chicago, and the animals would be butchered. While ranchers possessed and used the land, nobody questioned that, their form of agricultural production seldom involved improvements. And so farmers would come along and squat on the land, take possession of the land. The ranchers would try to evict them, they would go to court, and what they discovered was, in the 1870s and 80s, that they lost over 80% of the time. Now this is a historical puzzle, because the ranchers were very wealthy, and they were connected to very wealthy industries, the railroads and the slaughterhouses. They provided the food that the working people of Europe were eating. If they were so powerful, and they were, how come they lost so badly? It is a clue that helps us think about the distinctive features of American conceptions of property. Because the farmers, while they had some powerful backers, were by and large initially poorer and less powerful politically than the ranchers were. And yet they were able to prevail 4 times out of 5. The success of the farmers in securing legal title was due to the fact that they could demonstrate more effectively than the ranchers that they had made improvements to the land, that they had invested. They had not merely taken possession, as the ranchers had. The ranchers had taken possession by putting cattle or sheep on the land and then having the cattle and sheep go back and forth. The farmers had to dig wells. They had to put trees as windbreaks. They had to build more housing. And this is what the courts were looking for. Who was willing to invest in the land and make it worth something more? The courts insisted that there had to be substantial improvements made to validate title to land. And politicians, this is the other side of it, at both the state and federal levels wanted land to be available for settlement by small farmers who were ready and willing to participate in national and international markets. The focus on improvement as a requirement for establishing a lasting title to land was sealed by the movement to reform the tax system that had been initiated in this country by San Francisco journalist Henry George in his 1879 book, Progress and Poverty, which Rebecca Edwards talks about to some degree in New Spirits. George was particularly concerned about the rise in poverty in the United States in the decade following the end of the Civil War, as well as he was also horrified by the extreme concentration of land ownership that had developed in California after the U.S. conquest. We'll get into that a little bit later. George argued that this concentration of land ownership was the cause of poverty and economic instability. George advocated what he called the single tax system. Land, as the most important source of wealth, should be the primary source of government income, as opposed to customs duties at the time, customs duties on imports or on alcohol. And in order to promote democratic land ownership, George argued that land needed to be taxed at its highest possible use. If an improvement could be made, the government should tax the land as if the improvement had already been made, whether in fact an owner had made it or not. So if you could build a skyscraper on your property and make 50 times the income that you have by having a small building, the government's going to was going to tax you on the basis that that's what you had already done. And if you didn't do it, you would lose the land, obviously. You would probably not be able to afford to hold on to the land. Part of George's argument was that the profit land produced was the result of investments that society as a whole had made in transportation, education, police services, and therefore the social contract underlying the American Republic required that the profit that land produced should go back to society, while the profit that labor produced should stay with the property's owner. He wanted to penalize speculation while rewarding improvements. Now, by speculation at this time was meant the acquiring of property to let it sit undeveloped for an indefinite period of time until there were reasons for you to either sell it off at an augmented value without having put any investment in it, or to go ahead and make an investment. That was speculation. Building a factory or a packing house or planting orange groves where there had been grass for cattle, that was not speculation. That was improvements, if you see the difference. Speculation was to be punished, penalized, and improvements was to be awarded. Improvements made the land more productive. And he also wanted to prevent creation of landed estates that became a family inheritance. The whole idea of this would naturally lead to more frequent turnover of property. Instead of families holding on to property and passing it from generation to generation, as the British aristocracy did, for example, most likely the descendants, the heirs of deceased parents would have already established themselves in another line of work, and they'd sell off their family's property to keep the capital in circulation. Now, his book was a national and indeed international bestseller. His ideas inspired political movements across the country and in many other countries. In Australia, Norway, and Sweden in particular, but it had a wide-ranging influence. And tax systems were reformed. And so in most states outside the Deep South, probably an important point, tax policies by the end of the 19th century reflected Henry George's conceptions. Particularly the idea that land should be taxed at its highest profitable potential use. This became a distinguishing feature of